And now on to look at this Cop Killers feature. We're going to hear from Daniele Ganser. He's a professor over in Basel University in Switzerland, and he's talking about the precedent and the enormous track record that NATO has in actually creating terrorism right across the continent.
The scandal broke in Italy, and first it was believed that it's just another Italian mess, so to speak, because there's always a scandal in Italy, isn't there? And
right.
But then, it went further. The defense minister from Belgium at the time was in Italy, and, he read in the paper that also Belgium had a secret army, and he thought, gee, that's interesting. I'm the defense minister and I've never heard of it. And so he flew back to Belgium and he called his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the highest officer of the Belgian military, and he asked him, is it true what the Italian newspaper writes, that we have a secret army also in Belgium? And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Belgium said, yeah, that's true. And then the defense minister said, wait, that's a bit strange. Why don't I know nothing about it. I'm the defense minister. And then the military officer said, we are military officers and we dedicate basically our entire career, our whole life to military affairs. And you're just the defense minister, and a socialist further on, so governments come and go. And we're not going to tell every defense minister about the more secret operations that we have ongoing. And, it went on that the Belgian parliament then made an investigation. And in Belgium, you had the same structure. It was also part of the secret service, and within the secret service you had the secret army. And it was not only Italy and Belgium, it was also in Switzerland that we had a secret army. It was also in Germany that you had a secret stay-behind army. You had one in the Netherlands, you had one in Denmark, another one in Norway, then also in Spain and in Portugal, furthermore in Greece and in Turkey. And you also had one in Finland. Neutral Finland was not part of NATO at the time and still isn't today. Also in Austria, another neutral country, and in Sweden. So basically what you can say is that all of Western Europe was covered with a network of NATO stay-behind armies, which were designed to become operative in the case of a Soviet invasion. Obviously now we know today that the Soviet invasion never came, but at the time when these networks were set up, so in the late 40s and the early 50s, people weren't so sure.
Yeah. And you say that certain politicians, certain ministers were given information that these stay-behind armies existed, but many of them weren't. How was that decision made?
I think the fear of NATO, the fear of Washington, and also the fear of London was that if you give this information to a socialist minister or even a communist minister, a minister of the Interior, a minister of Defense, prime minister, whatever, then, the secret might be passed on to Moscow. So to speak, NATO did not trust all European governments to handle this secret in the sense that, you could tell Parliament or that you could tell the press, because strictly speaking, in a democracy, you can't have a secret army, okay? It's totally illegal. You can't. You can have a police force, you can have a secret service, and you can have an army. These are the three forces that are designed to guarantee security. But Parliament, which represents the population, must know who is in the defense forces, who is in the secret service. The parliamentarians must be able to know every name of every police officer carrying a weapon. And it's impossible that Parliament does not know about an entire network of secret armies. But in fact, that was the case.
Amazing, isn't it? And so it took the situation in Italy being exposed of the GLADIO secret fascist army controlled by NATO and the US over in Italy for the Belgian politicians to know, because they then went to their armed forces and said, do you have a secret army? And they embarrassingly had to admit, yes, we do.
Well, what didn't come through from that clip, or interesting as it was, is that these secret armies weren't just quietly secret. They went around bombing things and blowing things up and killing people. So in Belgium, for example, the so-called Brabant massacres took place, where people were shot at random in supermarkets, and the guns that were used for that were then planted on a left-wing splinter group in Brussels, and they were blamed for the deaths of, I think it was 11 people who were killed in these supermarket shootings. It needs to be repeated again and again and again so that people listening to this show understand it. NATO has a track record as a terrorist infrastructure. It is not just a club of democracies defending itself against bad people. And it's the people who thought it was their right to go around killing citizens at Bologna, for example, where 80 some odd people were killed in the bombing of 1980. Those people were never punished, and they are still in place. And so, for example, the shootings in the Maidan Square, which we discussed earlier in Kiev, by far-right groups shooting their own protesters, that was part of a GLADIO network, I'm virtually certain, given the history of those networks.
Okay, so we're going to have a look now at why this happens, and hear from Daniele Ganser, this professor from Basel University. He's the author of the book NATO's Secret Armies. And here he talks to the interviewee, who's Dr. Julian Charles from the website themindrenewed.com, about why. What was the point of killing innocent people?
Vincenzo Vinciguerra, he was this terrorist who had carried out the Peteano terrorist attack of 1972 that I spoke of a minute ago. And he gave this explanation. You know, he's now one who carried out terrorism in Europe and was found guilty and confessed. And he now explains why he did it. And he said this: you had to attack civilians, the people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people far removed from any political games. So basically, you just kill anybody in a railway station. The reason was quite simple. This is the quote of Vincenzo Vinciguerra. They were supposed to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. This is the political logic that lies behind all the massacres and the bombings, which remain unpunished, because the state cannot convict itself or declare itself responsible for what happened. End of quote. So we have here is basically a terrorist who says, I was protected by the state because the state wanted these terrorist acts to happen, because after that, the state could argue we need more power, you know, we need a surveillance technology, we basically need more money, or we need, you know, the many things you can actually ask once you have a terrorist attack, which you couldn't ask before. You know, you can ask people to stay at home after 8 o'clock, and if you ask this on a sunny day and there's no terrorism nowhere, people go, of course I'm not going to stay at home. It's sunny and it's Sunday, and of course I'm going to go out, I'm going to go clubbing. But if there's a terrorist attack and the next day you say everybody has to stay home after 8 o'clock, everybody goes, oh yeah, sure. And this is the shift of power. And what people don't understand is that terrorism can be used to actually steer people in certain directions.
But the question inevitably comes up to what extent this is organised by NATO or is even owned by NATO. I mean, to what extent is this really a NATO organisation? I mean, you've talked about these connections that are there and the allegations made by Vinciguerra, but how much of that can be substantiated?
One thing is solid. We know that these secret stay-behind armies were coordinated by NATO. That is for sure, because we have members, Italian generals, who directed the secret armies and who say, yes, very clearly, NATO had two branches which secretly coordinated these networks, and that was the Allied Clandestine Committee and the Clandestine Planning Committee. So these are substructures within NATO, and people don't understand that NATO is not a transparent organization. They think they can call NATO every day and ask about GLADIO, and, you know, the press officer would give them the information. That's not the case. NATO is a military organization, and it guards its secrets very well. I have another point. On November 5, 1990, NATO spokesman told an inquisitive press, and here's another quote, NATO has never contemplated guerrilla war or clandestine operations, end of quote. So in 1919, when the scandal broke, NATO said first, no, we know we have no link to Operation GLADIO. But then the next day, NATO officials admitted that the previous day's denial had been false, adding that the alliance would not comment on matters of military secrecy. So basically what NATO does is that they say, oh no, it doesn't exist, stay behind, no, nothing. And then, you know, you have enough other countries which say, okay, it does exist. And then NATO says, oh, yes, but we can't comment. It's top secret. And actually, the CIA and the MI6 did the exact same thing. They said, it doesn't exist. And when it was confirmed that it exists, they said, okay, we can't comment, And then when we tried, I mean, that is just a network of researchers who study secret warfare. When we said, but aren't you linked to terrorism? Then they say, that's what NATO, CIA, and MI6 say. Then they say, no, we have nothing to do with terrorism. If indeed somebody from the stay behind network was linked to terrorism, then this guy was a runaway agent. That was just somebody who's probably an alcohol problem or a sexual problem or a moral problem or all together, and we're not controlling this guy.
Right, so these are rogue individuals. And I suppose, could they also kind of hide behind a technicality? So you could say, well, there's proper NATO and there's kind of hidden NATO, and that's sort of functioning parallel to this. So NATO proper has nothing to do with this, and hidden NATO, well, we're not commenting.
That's it. It's actually a good phrase. NATO proper has nothing to do with terrorism, and hidden NATO might be involved in terrorism. But if you think about it, I mean, it is insane. If you look at the world today, obviously NATO today is saying we're fighting terrorism. And as a historian, I'm looking at NATO's history from 1949 onward to this very day.
That was Daniele Ganser being interviewed by Julian Charles, Martin. The Petite massacre we started with there, 3 police were killed by a fascist, and the whole thing was blamed on the Red Brigades. Now, this is an enormous effect, because what you got is basically one state organisation, NATO, killing people from another state organisation, security organisation, the police.
Yeah, well, the purpose of that is to get the police behind crackdowns on political opponents, the people that you're really targeting this at. Effectively, it was really aimed in Italy at preventing the PCI, the Communist Party, from becoming a party of government. That was a major goal of the planners behind GLADIO.
Well, the CIA, at the end of the Second World War, their first big operation was to fix the Italian elections, wasn't it? The first Italian elections after World War II.
Cooperating very closely with Luciano, who was the head of the mafia in New York, who they released from prison in order to help them do it. NATO's real history is one of manipulation. They've developed modern psychological warfare techniques whereby violent kinetic actions in which people die, spectacular actions, are used in order to try and steer public opinion in certain directions. So you have the Ergonokon networks in Turkey, which were based in the military intelligence world, who were running both fascist terrorist gangs and left-wing terrorist groups. In Philip Whitehead, I think, in his book on the Italian situation, said the right-wing fascists, the right-wing terrorists were glove puppets of the intelligence services. The left-wing terrorists were marionettes. And of course, you can be involved in one of these terrorist groups, as people may get involved in Al Qaeda today, and not know who is actually pulling the strings. And I'm afraid that all of the modus operandi of NATO during the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s has continued into our era, because nobody was ever punished for any of this, and nobody ever will be. Unlike, we agonise about what we're going to do about on-runs in Northern Ireland, should they face the courts and all the rest of it. Nobody from NATO has ever faced the courts, even though Imposimato, who's the head of the Italian Supreme Court, has pointed the finger very firmly at them.
Okay. Also, moving on to the sort of more modern stuff and the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, I just found it a pretty shocking coincidence, if you want to call it that literally the day before those attacks, the French President François Hollande had been saying that the effects of the Russian sanctions were so bad on his economy, which is faltering anyway, particularly the agricultural side of it, that he wanted an end to the sanctions, and the next day, boom.
Well, it may be that there's that direct connection, but we've seen the use of these attacks in order to try and steer public opinion on numerous occasions, sadly, since 9/11, which is probably the mother and daddy of them all. But I mean, the evidence that NATO is involved in these activities is overwhelming, I'm afraid.
And the final clip we're going to hear is actually about France, where Daniele Ganser, the author of NATO's Secret Army, talks to Julian Charles about the French situation, and takes us back to 1985 and the attack on the Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace's ship, in the Pacific.
In 1985, we had a terrorist attack which the French carried out. I have to briefly recap this for the listeners. The French were carrying out atomic tests in the Pacific at the time. So that was, atomic bombs. They wanted to test them, and they said, we test them in the Pacific. Nobody lives there anywhere. And then there is Greenpeace. This is an environmental NGO group. And they had a ship which was called the Rainbow Warrior, and they took this ship and brought the ship right there where the French Defense Ministry wanted to explode the atomic bombs. So Paris was not amused, and they said these Greenpeace guys are really stupid. They stop us from testing our weapons. They should get out of the way. Obviously, Greenpeace refused and had their ship there and said stop all nuclear tests and whatever. And then the French said, somebody has to take care of this. And what they did is they sent a group of secret agents, so the French military secret service, DGSE, Direction Générale Sécurité Extérieure. So that's, within the defense ministry, you have a secret service, and this secret service can carry out covert action operations. They sent a team there. The Greenpeace ship was in New Zealand, and they blew up the ship. So that's terrorism. And one Greenpeace guy died in the attack. And at that time, Admiral Pierre Lacoste was the director of the DGSE, and he had to step down because, it was revealed, and then, the press was looking into this, and they said, this is insane. Why is the French Secret Service blowing up, ships on the other side of the world? It's not possible. And this Admiral Pierre Lacoste, who, he was in charge of the operation, and, it's strange to call him a terrorist, but obviously he was the director of this terrorist operation. So in that case, he was a terrorist. He's not a terrorist in the sense that we think of him today, but he was linked to terrorism. And he then said that during the time when the Stay Behind NATO network operated in the 60s and the 70s, some terrorist action against de Gaulle and his Algerian peace plan had been carried out by groups that included, and that's a quote, a limited number of people from the French Stay Behind network. And that is now very, very sensitive again, because that means that part of the military and part of the secret services can turn against the government, because de Gaulle was the French president at the time, and he wanted to send Algeria into independence, and the French military thought this is total humiliation. They had already lost in Vietnam, and they'd lost, partly against Hitler, and now they had to let go the Algerian colony. They didn't want to, and so they turned with terrorism against de Gaulle, and that, according to Admiral Pierre Lacoste, included member of the French Stay Behind. So it's not limited to Italy, the problem. We also have in France what you call rogue elements, or maybe, people who just thought, now we have to fight our government. They have no clue. And it's intriguing. It's very interesting.
Rogue elements. No, I think maybe he's talking about rogue elements there. That's Daniele Ganser, professor from Basel University, and he's based in Switzerland, and he's author of NATO's Secret Armies. Now, Martin, what we're hearing there is that the French military and clandestine parts of the French military actually turning against the president, possibly even involved in attempts to assassinate the president of their own country.
Well, these kind of things can happen, and frequently they do happen. I mean, I think Daniele Ganser's research over 20 years has shown that there is definitely elements within the security structure in the West who engage in terrorist activities in order to try and steer public opinion in various directions.
Okay, so
the evidence for that is overwhelming.
Okay, so how do you think, or does it anyway, linked to these Charlie Hebdo attacks? Do you think there's any evidence that this may have been French Secret Service or NATO may have had a hand in this? Where would you go to look for that sort of evidence?
Well, I mean, the first thing to be said is when incidents like that happen, because of the history of NATO's terrorist activities, one of the suspicions about such an attack is that it is an orchestrated attack from within the security structure, either the French security structure or some other state, maybe the British, the Americans or the Israelis. It may be. So that's the first thing that people have got to realise. You've got to ask the question, when a terrorist attack takes place, don't presume that you know exactly who carried it out. Now, evidence in the particular case I would suggest things like the passport being found in the getaway car. These guys are total pros. They manage to get into the building perfectly straightforwardly. They carry out their attack. They try and get away, but then they leave their documents in the getaway car. That's the first thing that you'd point out and say, well, that doesn't look right. And, of course, this is not just me who's pointed this out. It's been pointed out by President Erdogan of Turkey, who was questioning whether this was what sort of a terrorist attack this was. And, of course, in Turkey, they've got massive experience of NATO, military, and the Turkish intelligence services being involved in terrorism.
As we were just hearing there. As we were just hearing
everybody knows that's what they do.
Well,
you know.
Not everyone over here knows, but
No,
certainly
they don't.
Daniele Ganser was explaining there that the Turkish had their own stay-behind army as well. So anyway, looking again at the Charlie Hebdo shootings, the Kouachi brothers, one of them was on a no-fly list, the other one on the watch list, both of them very high up the terror watch lists in France. The fact that they managed to get hold of weapons, the fact that they managed to get access to these offices, which were supposed to be protected by armed police, doesn't that indicate perhaps there was a deliberate breakdown by the French secret services?
Well, what may have happened there is that the people who carried out the attack were not these brothers. These brothers were already high-profile jihadi suspects, so that's why you find their document in the getaway car. The police find their document in the getaway car. The people who actually carried out the attack, because the way GLADIO attacks traditionally were carried out, is that in actual fact the people who were given the blame, like the International Communist Current who were blamed for the Brabant massacres, are not the people who actually carried it out. The attacks themselves, the Brabant massacres, according to the Hugh O'Shaughnessy in The Observer, was actually carried out by US Marines.
So what you're saying is this could be a hideous kind of theatre where real people are getting killed, and possibly by actors who are actually trained special forces, maybe even Blackwater, somebody like that.
The point about this, once people have got the idea, we don't know, when an incident occurs, we don't really know what's happened. No doubt many people have been killed in bomb attacks in Iraq today. Do we know what happened? No, we don't. We don't presume we do know. But, of course, what happens with these kind of spectacular events is that suddenly the whole population is mobilised to hate the perpetrators, etc. And these are very typical of these kind of psychological warfare operations.
We start to accept things potentially like, for example, curfews. That's one of the things Danielle was talking about there.
But the point about the history, which has been so successfully uncovered by Daniele Ganser in his academic research, and also by Frankovic, who made the documentaries for the BBC, which came out in 1993 about all of this.
That is the Operation GLADIO.
GLADIO
three documentaries. Yeah.
The fact is that in the current geopolitical situation, ordinary people need to realise that spectacular terrorist events are routinely orchestrated by their own security services. Not all of the events are orchestrated by the security services. There's plenty of mad people out there. But lots of the big ones, the suspicion has to be that they are. And so, well, what's the answer to that? Well, the answer to that, in my view, is police investigation. But what we saw in the Charlie Hebdo attack is that one of the police officers investigating it, Hebdo, I think his name was, supposedly committed suicide in his own office in the middle of the night. He's possibly finding some of the leads which would lead back to the real perpetrators. And the answer to all of this, in the end, is to get the perpetrators.
And do you think there may be...
Fernando Imposimato, who's the head of the Italian Supreme Court, has pointed the finger very firmly.
There may be pressure, for example, on that police inspector in France to go along with the official story, and he's saying, hang on, this doesn't make sense.
Indeed.
And he's actually pushing back a little bit, and that's where the problems come, because he won't go along with what's been already pre-written in the script.
Well, indeed, and we've seen the Republican movement in Ireland agree to give up its weaponry and to join in the political process on the understanding that the police service would be reformed and would become genuinely independent force. I think that is the way forward for people of goodwill.
Getting bigger by being better. The #1 choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.